out tonight to this talk and chance we have to interact with Professor James Torr. I'm just going to introduce Professor Torr a little bit before his talk tonight. Professor James Torr is the T.T. and W.F. Chow Professor of Chemistry, Computer Science, and Materials Science and Nanoengineering at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Professor Torr has over 800 research publications, over 140 granted patents, and over 1,000 pending patents, or 100 pending patents. His H-index is 178, with total citations of 150,000. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry. His research group works in materials science, energy, medicine, electronics, and single-molecule nanomachines. He founded 14 companies based on his academic research, 3 of which are now public companies. In addition to this, he has an active social media presence at rjamestorr, spanning YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Rumble, Facebook, and X. In 2024, on YouTube alone, there were 24 million views of his content for over 2 million viewed hours, which spans topics on science, faith, and the origins of life. For 10 years, Professor Torr has led weekly Bible studies in the living unit of maximum security prisons as well. He has been teaching a weekly Bible study to college students for the past 26 years, and he and his wife, Shireen, have served about 75 meals to students per week in their home for that entire time. They also distribute dozens of weekly meals to local cancer patients residing in church facilities and elderly shut-ins in Houston. The title of today's talk is A Scientific Challenge to the Proposals on Life's Origin. Could the Bible be true? Could you join me in welcoming Professor Torr?
Thank you for having me here today. And I see some old friends that were students, and now they're grown up and doing what they need to do. Today I'm going to, it's sort of a bifurcated talk in the sense that I'm going to start out talking about origins of life and the problems in the scientific proposals that have been put forth for the origins of life. And the bottom line of it is we just don't know. Scientifically, we have no idea how life began. And that's what I hope to show you. And then we're going to talk about faith and the resurrection and look at evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this is my family. Wanted you to get to know me. This is my wife, Shireen. She's in the back. We've been married for 43 years. And these are our children. Umbrina's our oldest. She has worked for 10 years as a mediator between Palestinians and Israelis. And then she went back to get her PhD, and she's going to be starting a postdoc at the University of Michigan very soon. This is her husband, Philip. And then we have Sabrina. She's an attorney in Houston. And then Josiah, he's an urgent care physician on the Las Vegas Strip. And then Ben actually just was in investment banking, and then he went to Harvard Business School and graduated about a year and a half ago from Harvard Business School, and now he's back doing private equity in New York City. And these are our 2 grandchildren, Umbrina and Philip's children. And I come from a Jewish home. I don't come from a Christian home. I was born into a Jewish home. I come from a secular Jewish home. I was born in New York City. And my friends tell me they can tell that I'm Jewish because in the family we've got a doctor, a lawyer, and a banker. So we should be all set. This is sort of just a collage of different areas that we work on in my research group and have worked on. And I'll take you through this kind of briefly. There's this area of laser-induced graphene. You can hit any carbon surface with a CO2 laser, a 10-micron laser. They're found in every machine shop. They do laser cutting. You can do scribing with them. And they'll turn any carbon surface into graphene. It's become the most popular way now to make graphene. There's over 500 papers a year coming out in the literature where people now use this process. This has led to a company that's just starting up. One of my former students is taking that on. These are carbon nanotubes. You can split longitudinally, many uses of those. This is for memory. This turned out to be memory. It was based on silicon oxide, using silicon oxide as a two-terminal memory system. It's called resistive random access memory. That's now in a commercial company that we started a number of years ago. We work in the area of traumatic brain injury and stroke. This is in another company right now, moved into it. This is where we learned how to have carbon nanotubes grow seamlessly off of graphene. And as soon as we saw that those electrodes had 2,800 meters squared per gram, we knew that they'd be a great electrode, and those have become the preferred electrode for lithium batteries, not lithium ion, but lithium metal, rechargeable lithium metal batteries. And that's in a company called Zeta Energy, which is in Houston, 50 or 75 employees now. This is graphene quantum dots. When we started this work, graphene quantum dots were $1 million per kilogram. We learned how to make these from coal. Coal is $60 a ton. And we made it in one step in 25% yield. So think about those economics. And so this is in a public company right now that we had started. Here's where we take plastic waste, a problem, and we convert it into a material that absorbs CO2 to tackle another problem. This is where we have these little nano cars. These are little cars that are 2 nanometers by 3 nanometers. They have 4 independently rotating axles, and they have a little motor, so you can shine light on this motor, and it will spin unidirectionally. And there's a reason for why it spins unidirectionally, and it can push the car across the surface. The motor actually spins at 3 million rotations per second. And we've used those motors where we can, instead of using it on a car, where we've put on a short peptide to recognize a particular cell surface, and those will drill through a membrane and into cells and kill them, so we kill cancer cells. This is killing a superbacterium. This is an area called flash graphene, where we can take any carbon material, we put a high voltage and high current across it. It breaks every bond in there, and all the carbon-carbon bonds then reconstruct as the thermodynamically most stable system, which is graphene. And so you can take any carbon system. So we take coal and we turn it into graphene, and it's done in about 10 milliseconds. And that's now translated into a company called Universal Matter, and they have in their pilot plant now, they're doing over 1 ton per day of graphene that way. And then we've taken that, and in addition to industrializing it, we've used this flash joule heating to clean up many types of waste. These are printed circuit boards. We flash these. We get out the precious metals. We get out the rare earth elements out of them. Every time you save something to the cloud, that is saved somewhere on a printed circuit board, somewhere in a server farm. Those printed circuit boards are replaced every 3 years, and so there's mountains of these waste. We recycle batteries this way. We redoing soil and lots of different things that we do with these. So that kind of gives you an overview of our research. Now let me turn to this area of abiogenesis. Abiogenesis, and again, this is not my definition, this is Webster's definition. Abiogenesis is the origin of life from non-living matter. To construct any convincing theory of abiogenesis, we must take into account the conditions of the earth about 4 billion years ago. Prebiotically relevant means that we're restricted to materials, procedures, and conditions that might have been available on an early earth. Now, nobody was present at life's origin, so we'll never really know how life originated. We'll never know. But that's not what we're seeking to answer. What we're seeking is an experimentally verifiable hypothesis as to how life might have originated. So there's a whole area of a study called Origin of Life, or abiogenesis. How did life begin? Such a fundamental question, I would argue that we're still clueless on it, though many people would argue otherwise, and I'll show you why I think we're clueless on this. Well, what are the textbook characteristics of life? Again, not my definition, but this is the textbook definition: responsiveness to the environment, growth and change, ability to reproduce, have a metabolism and breathe, maintain homeostasis, being made of cells and passing traits on to offspring. That's the characteristics of life. It's not the definition of life. Life is much broader than that. But those are the characteristics of life, and that you would find in any cell. Now, homeostasis is a steady internal physical and chemical condition. All right, now I'm not here to speak God of the gaps. I've never spoken God of the gaps. God of the gaps meaning that if we don't have an explanation for something, I therefore say, therefore it must be God. Now, as a scientist, I cannot do that because I don't know what the world will have for us in 500 years from now. I actually presume one day we will understand scientifically the origin of life, how life might have originated. I presume we will, but I'm saying that we are very far away from that now. That's not going to happen in the next decade or two. There's no way. And I'll show you by the end of this talk as to why I can say that. If you asked a man or a woman in the year 1700, would we ever put people on the moon and then bring them back? They'd be like, what are you talking about? We can't even fly, let alone have space flight. I mean, that would never happen. So things happen in the intervening 300 or 400 years. Things happen and that we can't easily foresee. So I don't presume, therefore, God. I'm just saying we don't know how life originated scientifically. Now, molecules are the language of living systems. You have small molecules that make up, for example, sugars make up carbohydrates, amino acids make up our peptides, most of our enzymes being based on these amino acids, the nucleotides which make up DNA and RNA, and then we have glycerol probably being the basis for lipids. So we have these four classes of compounds. So everywhere there's a little red arrow, that is a stereogenic center, or what some people call chiral center. And you have to be able to control that. Now, if you would argue that there are mixtures and you can deal with mixtures, we'll address that in a minute, but it makes it hard to control that. Here, these are not stereogenic centers, but they're enantiotopic centers, meaning that somehow you've got to distinguish these. And then you have the polymeric classes from these. And all of these bear information. Once you've made a polymer, that is now a code, that is a string. So you have a letter, but now you've made that into words, and that bears now information. Lipids also bear information, but not so much in the single lipid as in the array of lipids. And what we're finding now, when you have a lipid bilayer in a cell, those are constantly changing and migrating in the layout of those, and they're constantly changing based on what the cell is going through, and you get swarms of different lipid types moving around dynamically. But molecules don't care about life. They never have. They never will. Organisms care about life. Molecules don't care at all about life. They've never been known to move toward life unless an organism, like a person, has been pushing them in a certain direction. Molecules themselves have no brain. They have no desire to move toward life. In fact, they don't care to do that at all. Well, what's the state of origin of life research? Well, let me show you the state of that research. Nobody has shown a method to make the enantiopure versions of carbohydrates, amino acids, nucleotides, or lipids in a prebiotically relevant manner. Nobody's ever done that. Nobody's been able to do that. This whole idea of having chiral compounds, how do you do that? Nobody's ever shown how you could get this prebiotically, how you can control all of these stereocenters. Some people will say, well, you make all the different enantiomers of these things. And then somehow nature selected these out. Well, then you have to say, how did it select it out? How did nature select it out? What was the chiral molecule that nature used to select it out? Because the only way you select these out, a particular chiral molecule, is you have to have other chiral molecules acting upon them. So nobody's ever got these, so we don't have the starting materials. You say, well, these come in on meteorites. They don't come in on meteorites in pure form. They'll always come in mixtures. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of enantiomeric excess, but it's only slight. In the highest cases, you've seen about 60% enantiomeric excess, but that was never in a prebiotically relevant system anyway. Nobody's ever shown that life could form with lower enantiomeric excess mixtures, meaning this handedness. Nobody's ever shown that you could have had life starting on racemic mixtures. And there's a reason for that. There's a new phenomenon that's only been around for about 25 years. It wasn't around when I was your age in school. And that's called chiral-induced spin selectivity. And what we know now is we have a much better idea why nature does things as cleanly as it does. How come nature can do chemistry much better generally than we do in the lab? And we were taught, as many of you have been taught, that it's like a hand and a glove. An enzyme has a certain shape. Molecules fit into that certain shape. That's only half of the story. The other half of the story is that molecules and fragments of molecules and entities will have unpaired electrons, and the electrons can be either spin up or spin down. And because of that, they're selected which dynamic way they're going to go through a material. And so when you have, for example, a helix, those will select out a particular spin. So say only spin up will go through that helix, not the spin down, because the difference is when the wrong spin goes through that, you get a lot of backscattering and heat release. And that's why, while my computer will get very hot, our brains can put out a lot, and it only puts out 2 watts, 10 watts at the most, puts out very little heat. Why don't we burn up? Why don't all our cells burn up, in fact? It's because of chiral-induced spin selectivity, because they're selecting certain spins on electrons to only go through those chiral environments. You had to have chirality at the start of biology. It's not something that could have been evolved into. It had to be there at the start, and we know that now through chiral-induced spin selectivity. And through that, you can have 2 hydroxyl radicals go through an antiparallel surface and form hydrogen peroxide. If they go through a parallel surface, a triplet surface, you form oxygen and 2 protons. And so this is how chemistry happens in our bodies all the time, and we don't burn up. Nobody has shown that the mixtures found in meteorites or interstellar space could be useful for synthesis, because these come as gross mixtures. They couldn't be used. And they'll say, oh, well, we found an amino acid on this meteorite. Okay, what are you going to do with it? That amino acid, you can detect amino acids down to the 1 molecule level by mass spec. But when they come as mixtures of many different compounds, which they always do, they're unusable. Any chemist knows this. When you have vast mixtures, you can't use them. That's why nobody has ever used the mixtures that are found in meteorites to try to do chemistry. Nobody's ever solved the mass transfer problem in chemical transformations from small molecules to a cell. So say you had small molecules. How much of these would you need to go through and do all the synthetic steps necessary, the thousands of synthetic steps necessary to make a cell? Think about that. Are there any synthetic organic chemists here? Anybody studying synthetic organic, worked in a lab doing synthetic organic chemistry? Like nobody? You
I don't work in a lab, but
you took organic chemistry.
I helped teach a class.
You what?
I'm a course assistant for a class on organic chemistry.
Okay. All right, so you know a little bit about organic chemistry. Yeah, okay, nano bit. Okay, so when you work in a lab, what are you always doing? You're always bringing up starting material from the rear. You always have to continue to bring up starting material because your reactions aren't 100% yield. Say they're 70% yield. So you get 70% in your next step, say it's 70% in your next step. So you run out of material very rapidly. So you always bring up material from the rear. But what happens is if things were going along happily and molecules are moving toward life on an early Earth and it runs out of starting material, and it took 400 million years to get there, what do you do now? Well, you go back and you make more. But nature never kept a laboratory notebook. It doesn't know how to go back. It doesn't know to go back. It doesn't know what it's doing at all. And you run out of starting material. So how much starting material? You need tons and tons of all of these in order to do this, to build even the simplest of cells. So nobody's ever figured that out. Here's the amino acid problem. There's 20 canonical amino acids, 20 amino acids that predominantly 20 amino acids that make us up. 19 of the 20 have a stereogenic center. And it turns out that about half of them have active side chains. So you're not just hooking 2 ends together. There's another end hanging off that can compete for the reactive sites. Once one of those competes, game over. That peptide that you were making is no longer useful for anything. with the reactive side chains, nobody has ever even made small peptides when you have that active side chain there without getting that cross-linking. Once you cross-link, it's game over. So nobody's ever solved the polypeptide problem. Nobody's ever been able to take these amino acids and make a polypeptide. And plus that, the polymerization, the free energy is positive, meaning it doesn't go spontaneously. Even making a dipeptide. So this is what I challenged my Origin of Life colleagues with. I challenged them on YouTube, 10 of them. You know, what else am I going to do? I mean, you could just say these, but I challenged them. If you guys can do this, just make a dipeptide. Don't even make a polypeptide. Just hook 2 amino acids together. Can you do that in a prebiotic relevant manner when you have active side chains? So you see this amine is just like that amine. That carboxylic acid is just like that one. How do you deal with that problem? Nobody's ever solved it. You can't even put 2 together. You got to put hundreds and hundreds of these together, thousands and thousands of times. Never been solved. Nobody's ever solved the nucleotide problem. If you want to make RNA, you see the 3' is always hooked up to the 5', 5', 3', 3', 5', and all the way on through. But every time you try to do this randomly, you get 2' connection. Uh-oh, that's a big problem. You get 2' connection, it doesn't work. And that hydroxyl group right there will cause other side chain reactions. So I say, can you even just put 200 of these together? Because to make RNA, you got to put thousands of these together. Can you even put 200 together without this 2' branching occurring, or without side reactions? None of them has ever come forward saying they could do that. I challenged 10 of them. I said, go ahead, do this. I told them, if you do this, I will not talk about Origin of Life anymore. I will leave you guys alone. You guys can keep saying you've solved this thing. And nobody's come forward. And I said, you know, you don't even have to do it. Just propose how it could be done. And I won't even check you. You'll check yourselves. I let the students grade their own papers. I said, you check yourselves. Never happened. How about the carbohydrate problem? This is the big problem. Carbohydrates. Sugars. Carbohydrates are sugars. If you had 6 A bases, say in DNA, what's the ways you can hook that together? Like one way, A. But if you have 6 glucose molecules, how many different ways could you hook those 6 molecules together? It's over 1 trillion ways, because each of them has 5 hydroxyl groups that could be involved in the coupling. Each one of them has what's called this anomeric center, so this OH could be up or down. They could close as a 5-membered ring or a 6-membered ring, as you see here, or they could be in an open form. You put all of those combinations for all 6 of those, 6 glucose molecules can hook together over 1 trillion ways. Every disease in a cell is accompanied by a carbohydrate problem in hooking together. You hook these together wrong, the cell dies. It'll never have life. It's a big problem. That's how information is stored in a cell. If you think DNA stores the information, it does. But there's much more information that you can store in carbohydrates than you can in DNA or RNA. Much more, because of the diversity of ways that you can hook this together. Every one of these polymers is an information coding system. I said, don't even make 6. Just hook 2 glucose molecules together with this chemistry. Nobody could do it. Just put 2. Now, you can do this with modern techniques where you block certain things. It's hard, but you can do it, but not in a prebiotically relevant manner. Nobody could do it. So how could we ever be close to solving life? The stability problem. What you do is you take a half-life. So if you have a mole of molecules, 6 times 10 to the 23rd molecules, and it has a half-life of 100 days in water, say, so you'll just have half of those many around. But if you only have 1 molecule that happened to form that might be of the right sequence, how long would that molecule last? So say you had a 600 mer of RNA, which is rather short RNA, actually. If RNA has a half-life of 100 days, you have to convert that half-life to a probability now, because you're dealing with a single molecule, and that turns out you have 4 hours. So this whole idea that, in Origin of Life, you have billions of years. Time is the enemy. For organic chemistry, time is the enemy. Everything falls apart. Everything falls apart. That's what happens. So if you have a single 200-mer polypeptide in water, it has a lifetime of 13 days for a polypeptide. So time, this whole idea that time is your friend, no, actually time is your enemy. Everything falls apart. All right, what about the Leventhal 1.0 paradox? That's how does a protein fold? How does it get into its right structure? Unless you have other proteins helping this along, they don't normally fold very well. Now, you can have some proteins fold without foldamers, but not all of them, and there's a big problem. Even if you had just 100 residues, 100 amino acids, you have 10 to the 95 possibilities of conformations. And even these authors say that even a small protein that initiated folding by a random search at the time of the Big Bang would still be thrashing about today. Once you're over 10 to the 40th, there's not enough time in the universe to do this. That's the problem. But that's a small problem compared to Leventhal 2.0. That's the interactome problem. Just if you think of how molecules non-covalently interact with each other in a cell, just the protein-protein interactions in a simple yeast cell, just protein-protein. So we're not talking protein-RNA, RNA, DNA action. No, just protein-protein, non-covalent interactions. Here's the number of combinations, 10 to the 79 billion. Now, that's kind of a big number. The number of elemental particles in the universe is 10 to the 90. This is a big number. You wouldn't have enough time in a million universes to do this. That's in a single yeast cell. So what happens is that cell will move that information to both sides, and then it necks down and divides. That's how the information is transferred. But where did that information come from originally? Nobody knows. So nobody has solved the code problem. Where's the origin of the code? You have to have a code to do this. What's the origin? Nobody has ever addressed the code problem. And if you say, well, it randomly formed, okay, it randomly formed. The chances of this are really, really small, but say one formed. And then what? If you have this in RNA by the RNA world hypothesis, you have much less than 4 hours, because that's going to be a lot longer than a 600-mer. So you have minutes or seconds that it would survive. Nobody knows where life came from. Some people say, well, cells were very simple at the start. So biophysicists have calculated how simple a cell could be. And the simplest cell has to have all of these pieces. You know how many people have made any of these pieces in a prebiotically relevant manner? You know how many pieces of these have been made? 0. None of these functions has ever been made. All of these would have to be made. And this cell would be so simple it wouldn't be able to make any of its own amino acids. It would have to get all of that exogenously from the outside. All right, so what's needed to make a simple cell? Well, you need all of the small molecules in an anti-pure form. How do you get that? Nobody knows. So what I will do is I will give you all of those. I'll give you all of the small molecules. You say those came in on meteorites? Okay, I'll give it to you, even though most of them burn up, and they're usually in unusable mixtures, and they usually don't have high enantiomeric excess. But if I gave those to you, how would you make the polymers? Nobody knows. You can't even make the disaccharide. You can't even make the dipeptide. Nobody knows. All right, so I'll give you those. Just give it to you in any sequence you want. So now I've given you also the information. So now I'll give you all of that. How would you make a cell? Propose. You don't even have to do it, just propose. How would you do it? So assuming you had access to all the parts in your lab, how would you make even a simple cell? So I'm not even talking under a rock or in a tidal pool. In your laboratory, if you had all the parts of a cell, because you can take a cell and you can deconstruct a cell and have all the parts, put it in individual bottles and say, have at it, make a cell. Nobody would ever suggest that they could make a cell. Nobody would ever suggest that they could do that. Nobody knows how this thing happened. That's how far we are. So there's a lot more challenges. Imagine you'd have to remove all human intervention if you wanted to have origin of life. You'd have to be able to deal with these impure mixtures or separations. You'd have to solve the relay synthesis, meaning that you can't start near the end. You've got to start from very small molecules like methane, CO2, carbon monoxide, ammonia. That's where you got to start. You have to solve the condensation polymerization where the free energy is positive. None of these reactions wants to go spontaneously. None of them wants to go. You have to put certain techniques in a laboratory to get these coupling reactions to go. They don't go spontaneously. The free energy is positive. You got to pay homage to thermodynamics. It's hard to get around that. And then the resurrection of a cell. Can you resurrect a cell? So another challenge. How about we just take a cell that just died, bring it back to life? Because everything's kind of there in place. A resurrection should be a little bit easier than an ab initio synthesis, right? You got all the chemicals are already there. Just put the thing together. Nobody could just. In fact, we can't even well define what it is we just lost. When we lost, then that cell died. What is it that was lost? It's hard to describe. We can talk about certain functions, but it's really hard to describe. So with that, has science explained the origin of life? Not even close. Science might explain it someday, but that day is far from today because we're getting further away from a solution due to our increased realization of the complexity of a cell. The cell has become more and more complex that we realize its complexity with time. Because we learned, for example, the interactome. That's something we've just learned recently, how complex the interactome is. Remember the 10 to the 79 billion? So the cell gets harder every day, not just because the cell is evolving, but because our understanding of the cell went from being just a bunch of protoplasm to being a factory. So the goalposts are moving. And so this is how you can track whether you're getting close to a solution. Because what you do is you say, how far am I away from a solution? And so we might be able to move a little bit closer, but the cell has moved another mile away. And we move this, it's moved 10 miles more away. So you can track whether you're getting close to a solution, but if it's moving further away than you are approaching it, the solution is nowhere in sight. Okay, so this is just from a couple days ago, March 29, 2025. How did the first cells form on Earth? Scientists think they finally figured it out. This is what I got to deal with. Welcome to my world. And these types of articles come out all the time. Scientists think they finally figured it out. You know, every month they finally figured it out. It's sort of like fusion. I mean, we're almost there. It's just around the corner. We're almost there. And they'll keep talking about this thing. Why do they do this? Why is it? Do they do it for money? Because that way they keep the money flowing into origin of life studies? But it's kind of a fundamental question. How did all this happen? And if you just say, well, space aliens dropped it here, I'm okay with that. But that doesn't answer the question. It's the origin of first life. How did those space aliens get here? Where did they come from? That's the question. Something as fundamental as life we're clueless on. That's why I say we're clueless on the origin of life. So let me talk about another facet of life. And this is where I bifurcate. This is where I turn the corner. There's a whole other side of life that deals not with the molecular interactions, not with the stereochemistry, the whole other facet of life that deals, why do I love this person so much? Why are these feelings? Why am I going through all these things in my head? This is this other facet of life. And the Bible talks about how this is really the crux of the matter for Christianity. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. It doesn't say that you got to believe in the Adam and Eve story. It doesn't say that you got to believe in the flood. It doesn't even say you have to believe in the virgin birth. But it's that Jesus is Lord and that he's risen from the dead. That's the key. He's risen from the dead. Now, how can somebody raise from the dead? How can they expect an educated person to believe that somebody has risen from the dead? How can this be? If these guys were just trying to start some new religion, they never would have made this as a requirement. Because this is too hard. None of us has a data point on this. This is not an NDE, a near-death experience, where a heart stops for a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes and they're being resuscitated. And then they come back and say, you know, I was going through a tunnel. This is not that. This is in a grave for 3 days. How can anyone believe that? Why not just make it easy? You got to believe Jesus loved children. Or you got to believe Jesus loved puppies. Something interesting, something that we can accept. This is so hard. How do you believe that somebody has risen from the dead? Well, what do most academic religious scholars agree upon? So if you were to go to the religion department and you talk to the religious scholars, most of them are not Christians. Most of them don't even come from Christian backgrounds. But what would most of them agree upon? Well, they'd agree upon that there was a man named Jesus who died by crucifixion. There's a lot of historical evidence for that. Some even suggest that this is the most solid fact of that period in history. There's just so much written about that. They'd say the disciples of Jesus asserted that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. Many of those disciples died for that assertion. They're not saying that they believe it. They're saying the disciples of Jesus asserted that he had risen from the dead, and they died for that assertion. That's what the historical record would show. And it's not just history written on paper. It's history written in mosaics. It's history written on coins. There's so much around this. And number three, that certain unbelievers, such as Jesus' brother James, and even enemies of Jesus, such as Paul, asserted that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. They too died for that assertion. So that's what they would agree upon. So these are some facts that we'd have to start with, that they would agree upon. There was another historian. His name was Will Durant. He was one of the greatest historians of the 20th century. He wrote The Story of Civilization. Has anyone ever been familiar with the story of civilization? Anybody here? Okay, a few people. Okay, so we've got more of you than we had of synthetic organic chemists in here. And it's an 8-volume series. It's a huge encyclopedia-sized thing. He has in volume 3, it's called Caesar and Christ. And lest you think Will Durant was a Christian, he was not. He was an American historian, probably the greatest. And he says of himself, I'm still an agnostic with pantheistic overtones. But he's an expert historian. What do expert historians see? I'm a chemist. So if you could put two chemical structures on paper and ask me, would those two react? And I could just look at them and tell you whether a reaction would occur. And I could tell you whether it would occur quickly or slowly. You say, how do you do that? Well, I'm trained. I mean, that's how I'm trained. So when a person's trained in something, they can do what the common person cannot do. Well, a historian is trained to understand the veracity of the documents that they're reading. So, for example, if you had a car wreck in the middle of an intersection, and you went to the 4 different intersections and you asked 4 different people what they saw, the story, there was a car wreck, but the details would be different. That's normal. They're all at a different perspective, and the story's always going to be a little bit different. What any lawyer knows, what any prosecuting attorney knows, that if you have multiple stories that are identical, somebody's lying. There's collusion. The stories are not identical. So it's historians see that. If everything's absolutely identical, there's been collusion. If the police asked, say, the wife of the man who had been driving through the intersection and had the accident, and the wife says, you know, my husband, the light was red when he went through it. Now, it had just turned red, but it was red. They would put a lot of stock in what that woman said because you would think that she would be sympathetic to the driver because she's the man's wife. When a historian sees the writers writing things about themselves or about their main character that are not the most flattering, it substantiates for them. It gives them higher credence. So it's these types of things. So what did he write? Commenting on the Gospels, he wrote, the contradictions are of minutia, not substance. In essentials, the synoptic Gospels agree remarkably well and form a consistent portrait of Christ. So he says that if you say there's contradictions here, that's normal. That's different people telling the same story. This is minutia, that's not substance. So when a person says to me, the Bible's full of contradictions, I said, could you name for me 3? Well, it's full of contradictions. Okay, name for me 3. Nobody's ever named for me 3. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to grab your smartphone, contradictions in the Bible. But we can deal with those. But if somebody picked up my organic chemistry textbook that I use in my class, it's 1,200 pages. If you looked at that for 15 minutes and you came to me and you said, it's full of contradictions, doesn't make any sense, I would think that that person's an idiot. You can't look at that 1,200 pages in 15 minutes and make such an assertion. Yet you do that with the Bible. That's what you did. You looked at it for 15 minutes and came with that assertion. An expert historian says, there's not the contradictions there. That's minutia, not substance. In the enthusiasm of its discoveries, the higher criticism has applied to the New Testament tests of authenticity so severe that by them 100 ancient worthies, for example, Hammurabi, David, Socrates, would fade into legend. So a few hundred years ago, about 250 years ago, higher criticism came where they would take the New Testament and say, this couldn't be true, this couldn't be true, this couldn't be true. And what that did is it made the New Testament a much stronger document. Because then they started saying, okay, it says that there was a city at this site, they dig and there is that city. There was a pool at this site, they dig and there was a bathing pool there. They find coins that substantiate what the scriptures had said. They find the inscription of Pilate on coins from that era. Again and again, the apologetics then came in and made the New Testament a much stronger document as a result. He says if you had applied this to any other ancient document, it would have faded into legend. Despite the prejudices and theological preconceptions of the evangelists, that's the apostles, they record many incidents that mere inventors would have concealed. The competition of the apostles for high places in the kingdom, their flight after Jesus' arrest, Peter's denial, the failure of Christ to work miracles in Galilee, the references of some auditors to his possible insanity, his early uncertainty as to his mission, his confessions of ignorance as to the future, his moments of bitterness, his despairing cry on the cross. No one reading these scenes can doubt the reality of the figure behind them. He says these writings don't suggest people making this stuff up. There's no way. The way they write of themselves and of Jesus, this isn't made up. This is to an expert historian who's trained to discern these things. This is what he writes. That a few simple men should in one generation have invented so powerful and appealing an ethic, so powerful and appealing a personality, so loft an ethic, and so inspiring a vision of human brotherhood would be a miracle far more incredible than any recorded in the gospel. You got lots of miracles recorded in the gospel. Jesus raising people from the dead, healing the lame, making the deaf hear, the blind see. He says, that's nothing. If you think that guys could have made this up in a single generation, this story, that would be a greater miracle than anything that's told in the Gospels. After 2 centuries of higher criticism, the outlines of the life and character and teaching of Christ remain reasonably clear and constitute the most fascinating feature of the history of Western man. So what's the evidence for the resurrection? Well, Jesus rose in the morning. The sun was up. He rose in the morning. He appeared to Mary. He appeared to another group of women. Why would he appear to women? Why does the gospel say that he appeared to women? Women had no legal testimony in those days, either in Israel or in Rome. It's just like you can't put a 6-year-old on a witness stand because 6-year-olds make stuff up. Women were viewed the same way at that time. So why would the gospel record that he appeared first to women? Because that's the way it happened. Because that's exactly the way it happened. And he sent them as his emissaries. He said, go tell my disciples I've risen from the dead. Mary went and some of the other women went, not all of them. And they told the disciples, and the disciples didn't believe them. So it wasn't like they were trying to psych themselves up. They didn't believe them. But it says Peter and John ran to the tomb nonetheless. They saw the stone rolled away. They saw the Roman guard was gone. They saw the seal of Pilate was broken. They went into the tomb and something hit them. They saw the grave clothes. If somebody had stolen that body, they would have taken with the grave clothes. They put a sheet around the body, and then they take strips and go round and round and round. They wouldn't have taken the time to take the grave clothes off. But the grave clothes were there. And in fact, it even says, rolled up. How do you get it rolled up? There's no longer a template around which to roll if you're going to try to make the rolling up. It was as if something just passed right through this. That was enough, just to see the grave clothes, the empty tomb, the grave clothes there, the stone that the women couldn't have rolled away themselves. That was enough, and John left believing, it says. Peter wasn't convinced, he was bewildered, but it got him thinking. Then Jesus appeared to them in the upper room. It says they thought they were seeing a spirit. He says, no, guys, come here. He commanded them to touch him. He says, see, I have flesh and bones. He commanded them to touch him. I'm giving you a New Testament account. I've just given you evidence for the veracity of the New Testament based on historical views and academics' views. He says, touch me. See, I have flesh and bones. Then he said, have you something here to eat? The Bible's very specific. It says they gave him a piece of broiled fish. Broiled fish. Very descriptive. And he ate it in front of them. He demonstrated that he was physically risen from the dead. He then disappeared from their midst. Thomas then came to them. He said, Thomas, hey, we've seen the risen Savior. Thomas said, I don't believe it. Must have been an imposter. Some tall, thin guy with a beard or something. He thought it was Jesus. No. Thomas said, I won't believe it unless I stick my fingers into the holes in his hands. And unless I stick my hand into the hole in his side, because when Jesus was on the cross, he died after about 6 hours, which is relatively short. They wanted to be sure that he was dead. After many more hours, a Roman soldier thrust his spear into the side of Jesus, and it says blood and water gushed out. Why blood and water? Because the blood had already coagulated. You get blood coagulating, and then you get this aqueous phase. So you get the coagulated blood. Jesus had to have been dead. You can't have coagulated blood in you like that and be alive. He says, into that wound I need to stick my hand. Because he was up on the hill watching all of this happen. Jesus then appears. He says, Thomas, come here. Stick your finger into the holes in my hands. Thomas is commanded to do this. How can you resist the risen Savior in his command? And then he said, now, Thomas, stick your hand into the hole in my side. Thomas had to insert his hand into the hole in Jesus' side. No man is walking around with a hole in his side big enough for a man to insert his hand and inviting people to do it. And Jesus wasn't buckled over in pain. He had risen from the dead. He appeared to them indoors and out of doors, in Jerusalem, in Emmaus, on the 3-hour journey. It's a 3-hour walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus. He appeared to them on the road and the way. He appeared to them on the Mount of Olives. He appeared to them at the Sea of Galilee in the north. He stood on the shore and he told them where to throw their nets to catch some fish. This is what he did. And he counseled them there on the shore, from the shore. We have testimony in the New Testament how James the apostle was run through by the sword by Herod had him killed. The others we have from extra-biblical testimony. Now I'm going to give you extra-biblical testimony. I've given you biblical, not extra-biblical. Peter was crucified upside down. Bartholomew was flayed alive, which means they pin you down to the ground and they peel the skin off you like you're a fish. Another was boiled in oil. Tacitus, a Roman senator, he was also a historian. He was the one who wrote about how Nero had set Rome on fire. He's that historian. He was a brutal historian. He was the one who wrote about how they were putting Christians to death in Rome. He said we would tie fresh animal skins to them and we would throw them to the wild dogs. And he talked about how they weren't recanting their testimonies. There was another man named Pliny, P-L-I-N-Y, Pliny the Younger, in Asia Minor. He was a Roman governor, which is current-day Turkey. And he wrote a long letter to Trajan, the emperor of Rome. He said, I have many Christians in my province, and I'm putting many of them to death because they say Jesus is alive and they're worshiping him. And Trajan wrote a shorter letter back. He said, if they're going to continue to do that, go ahead, put them to death. What's amazing is that these men and women were going to their death. You know, when Watergate occurred, I remember that. When Watergate occurred and the FBI said, you know, if you guys don't come clean, the first person that comes to us, we're going to go easy on them. The rest of you, you're going to go to jail. And everybody flocked to the FBI to be the first to tell what happened. It didn't last 1 week. They couldn't keep their story quiet 1 week. Chuck Colson and several others went to jail because of that. These folks went to their death, and they never recanted this confession that they had seen Jesus alive. No man, no woman dies for what they know to be a lie. There's no advantage in that. They died for what they knew to be true. That's what they went to their death for. They'd be like boiling the oil with this guy in it. If he made this up, he'd be like, hey guys, April Fools, psych, let me tell you where we hid the body. That's what it would be like. They went to their death because they knew Jesus had risen from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead. This is the testimony. Now I'm going to share with you one last short story from Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9, a man brings his son to Jesus for healing. And he brought his son to Jesus' disciples. Jesus wasn't there for healing, and they were unable to heal his son. Then they see Jesus coming down off the mountain. He grabs his son, he runs to Jesus. And he says, Lord, heal my son if you can. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. And the man said something quite profound. He said, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. And Jesus didn't say, okay, look, you go away. When you have 100% belief, you come back and I'll pray for your son and he'll be healed. Jesus immediately healed his son. I don't know if the man's belief was 50% or if it was 25%, but whatever it was sufficient for Jesus to heal his son. And once Jesus healed his son, I bet the man left with a much higher assurance that Jesus is a healer. And the reason I tell you that is this. We can't have 100% assurance of anything in this life. I don't even know that I'm really here. For all I know, this is all a computer simulation, and you're a bunch of avatars, and I'm an avatar, and we're just electrons in transistors or in some quantum device. This isn't real. I don't have 100% assurance of anything in this life, but we act upon the level of assurance that we have. And we say, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. And the Lord heals. Today, I put this verse before you again, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that he's risen from the dead, you will be saved. I'm going to pray a prayer today, right here in this room, and I invite you to pray that prayer with me. And you say, well, I'm not 100% sure of his resurrection from the dead. He's not calling you to 100%. We're going to say in this prayer, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. So we'll be honest with the Lord. And you act upon it today. Don't let this day go by, because I'll tell you this. I don't think you'll ever have an appeal like this for you again coming to you in your lifetime. You say, you don't know that. I don't. But I'm just going based on what I've seen in my own life, where I've been offered such appeals. This day, when you've seen this evidence, you've heard the evidence of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, act upon whatever measure of faith it is that you have, 50%, 25%, 10% assurity that he's risen from the dead. I want you to pray a prayer with me and act upon that. Let's pray. Abba, my Father, I pray for these young people that they would repeat with me in prayer this day. Lord, thank you for dying for me because I am a sinner. Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. I believe Jesus is Lord, and I believe he's risen from the dead. Fill me with your Holy Spirit and let me live for you. In the name of Jesus. Amen. If you've prayed that prayer today, you come up and see me afterward or send me an email to tour@drjamestour.org. All right? Just let me know. Because I don't think you'll ever have an appeal like this again, ever in your life. And if you didn't pray that prayer and you want to engage with me again, and I'll talk you through this again, and we'll go right through this again, send me an email to tour@drjamestour and tell me that you were here, and I'll respond to you, and we'll get together by Zoom, and I'll take you through it. Okay? All right, with that, I'm going to end and open it up for questions. Thank you.
So we have about an hour for questions. We're gonna have 2 mics running around. Feel free to raise your hand, and we'll come by as soon as we see the hand, and we'll ask the questions just to, make sure all the questions that we have can be answered. And the format we're gonna have is 1 question, no follow-up. So we're gonna take the mics back after each question is asked. Yeah, and Professor Torres as well, if you'd like to take a seat. You've been standing for an hour. There's a chair over.
No, I'm good. Okay. I'm good. Our normal lectures run an hour and 20 minutes, so this is what I do.
Light work.
It's my life. Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had a question about the sugars. Forgive me, I'm not a chemist, but you mentioned that you can connect these 2 sugars in the lab, but you can't do it out in the earth because it requires a lot of energy. But I'm thinking about all these sources of energy in the earth that exist, volcanoes or the sun, or what makes it so particular that you can only do it in the lab but not on Earth?
No, there's enough energy out there to do this. So the problem is you want to hook them together in particular ways. You have to hook them together in particular ways. And they end up hooking at the wrong sites. That's what happens. And so in the lab, what you do is you take human-designed groups and you block all the other positions, and then you hook just the 2 remaining positions, and then you deblock them. So it's a very sophisticated human-derived thing with all these human-derived methodologies. And so it's like each one of these steps is like building a car. I mean, it's a lot of work that has gone into developing these methods. So you can do it in a lab using modern techniques, but they're not prebiotically relevant, meaning that it could have never happened in nature that way because all of these are human-designed methods. Yeah, but there's plenty of energy to do this, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the concept of prebiotically relevant a few times. I was just wondering what you meant by that. And I was curious as to your positions. Are you giving all of this evidence to say that the evolution theory is not true, cannot be true? I wasn't able to grasp your position on this fully.
So prebiotically relevant means that you have to use conditions that would have been available on an early Earth. So the early Earth didn't have laboratories. The early Earth didn't have many human-made reagents that we buy from chemical manufacturers. So you have to do things mimicking those conditions. That means it's prebiotically relevant, right? So what we do in our laboratories today is not prebiotically relevant because we use techniques and we use tools that were not available on an early Earth, okay? That's what prebiotically relevant means. Now, I didn't touch at all on evolution. So there's 2 different areas. There's abiogenesis. There's the study about how life came about. Then there's another area of evolution. Once you have life, how do you go from simple forms of life to more complex forms of life? That's the study of evolution. I never touched on that. I only dealt with how do you make the first life to begin with? Because, and so Charles Darwin never dealt with abiogenesis. He even conceded that that's an unknown. That was an unknown for him. Evolution is something else, and that I didn't deal with. Now, evolution has its own problems. There's a lot of problems with evolution, but that's a whole different study. But I didn't even touch on that. Okay.
Thank you, Doctor, for your beautiful prayer. I wanted to ask you also on this topic of abiogenesis and the chemistry about if it's possible to derive some of the more complex structures out of a simpler subset of original structures, thinking about whether, for example, in the area of amino acids and proteins, if for some of the proteins that have multiple functional places for attachment, whether it's possible for the subset of the 8 amino acids that don't have such points of attachment, if they could potentially evolve out the other amino acids, and in particular whether it would be possible to, in more controlled environments, like for example, the deep sea vents hypothesis is one that gets kicked around a lot in the abiogenesis circles, or there's also the sort of deep sea pressure pools hypothesis, which is somewhat distinct from the deep sea vents because that's also low temperature, which facilitates and high pressure, which facilitates far longer half-lives for the molecules at play on the bottom of the ocean.
Okay, so first of all, deep sea vents, which are hot, the lifetime of molecules is much shorter, okay? Not longer, much shorter. And the deep sea vents are at temperatures where you get racemization, meaning that if you happen to have something where you had molecules with pure stereogenicity, meaning that they were enantiopure, they had one-handedness. Those are now going to racemize at those higher temperatures. Racemization is always faster than coupling reactions. It's another problem with the deep sea vent hypothesis. If you deal with the 10 amino acids that don't have active side chains, and you say you could make polypeptides from those, you could. But without those reactive side chains, you don't have the ability to do the folding that you need to fold. Could those somehow then form a template that give you the other ones that might help to make the other ones? You could do that. It'd be hard to come up with a scenario, to map out a scenario, but if you're just thinking wildly, yes, the answer is yes. Could you make enzymes, but we don't know of enzymes that don't have any of the ones with the active side chains. Those are generally the ones that give us the strong interactions for other groups to hold them in place. The weaker interactions do come from those other groups. You get these hydrophobic interactions. So that's an interesting hypothesis. And so what I always do is I give you that. I'll just give it to you. Even though it'd be hard to think about that, but I'll give you all the polypeptides you want. Let's just say they can all be made. Now what? Remember, I've given you the entire deconstructed cell with all the correct polymerization. So what you're going to make is random, and what I'm giving you is with a code. Now what? You've still got to, and I'll give you all the sugars, even with all the code. Even if you had all of those, we don't even know what to do. We have no idea how to package these things together. We got to deal with an interactome that has 10 to the 79 billion combinations. So many hurdles. So what I do is it's sort of like what my father did. My father used to give Christmas presents to everybody, and at Christmas time he would give $1 million gifts. He would buy raffle tickets and give them to people. He was very generous with this. I'll give it to you. This is what I do. I'm very generous with giving whatever part people want. I give it to them. Because then they see, there's this forest of other stuff that I've got to deal with that makes this impossible. Okay?
Thank you for your talk. I was thinking that when we think about DNA, RNA, and protein, the one thing that comes to my mind is structure. Do you think structure was evolutionarily conserved when we talk about evolution or any kind of model?
Yes, yes. Structure is always conserved in evolution, always conserved. If it were not, there would be no evolution. Structure has to be conserved, and you see that all the time. I mean, you can watch evolution in a laboratory. This microevolution, as it's called. I mean, we do a lot of bacterial work in my own lab, and you can see changes in bacteria that occur. But structure is always conserved. If it were not well conserved, there would be no evolution. In fact, one might even be able to put as one of the definitions of evolution as a structural conservation with small perturbation.
Hi, Dr. Tor. Thanks for being here. I read the Earth article that you cited in your presentation the day it came out, and I thought it was interesting. Scientists always have such compelling stories and data. I hear you when you say that like scientists are like always almost discovering the answer to this, but we're really finding that things are only getting more and more complicated the more knowledge and information you find out. But then you also had that point that's like science has exponentially advanced to the degree that we're able to find answers to things that we never would have imagined in the 1700s. So I guess my question is, let's say science does discover the origin of life, like where would that leave you and your initial proposition for this talk?
I would be so happy. I would be so happy because, prior to the mid-1950s, people did not really understand a molecular basis for the fact that if you have two parents that are tall, their child is tall. They didn't have a molecular basis for that. And then the structure of DNA was figured out just in like 1952, 1953, right around in there. So certainly within the lifetime of many people that are alive today, certainly in the lifetime, earlier in their life, it wasn't known. So that doesn't make God less in my eyes because we understand how he preserves this information. That actually makes him more marvelous in my eyes. It's like, oh, that's how you did it. I mean, this is amazing. And there's this whole molecular basis for this. And that's why I'm a chemist. I mean, God's a chemist. I mean, it's all stored in the molecules like this. So I think the more we learn about creation, the more amazing God becomes. Because it's not just a bunch of protoplasm that does this. It's such a sophisticated system that does this. So what we're learning about cellular structure, for example, is that there's layers and layers and layers of information that have to take place here. And it's like this massive computer program of layers of information and this whole area of systems chemistry that needs to take place. It's really, really magnificent. I say as a scientist, I chase the universe trying to explain it. And God's word defines the universe. He says something, these amazing things happen. And so it actually makes me able to appreciate far more, I think, creation than the man or the woman on the street can appreciate it. Because I can look at a leaf and in my mind's eye, this is what I do. I'm projecting in my mind's eye. I look at that leaf and I think there's a magnesium atom sitting in the middle of a porphyrin. So these nitrogen atoms surrounding this magnesium. And there's photons of light hitting that, and electron injection now occurring, down 100 angstroms occurring to start the photosynthesis process to convert CO2 to carbon to build that tree. Who else can do that? I mean, there's not many of us that can do that. Now, if you've taken organic chemistry, you can do that. So it gives you a much greater appreciation for the wonderfulness of God's creation. It doesn't make God less in my eyes. It makes him even greater.
Dr. Tor, you mentioned that time is not your friend, and that there's not enough time for these structures to form during randomness. Just so I understand the time scale, if Earth is about 4.5 billion years old.
Yeah, let's give it the universe. I'll give you 14 billion.
Okay. And life around 3.5 billion years old, is 1 billion years not enough time for randomness?
No, not at all. And in fact, it's not 1 billion because we know that nothing could have happened before the cooling from the great heavy bombardment. So after the Earth cooled, then these things could start happening. The Earth was just blazing hot. And this is why we have all these elements on the surface of the Earth. It's amazing. We have the periodic table right here. All of these is just showered here. And so we have so much. And so it was after that cooled, and it turns out that the time between the Earth cooling and the signs of life is very, very short. It's very short. And there's no way that the time, so the time is actually not 14 billion years, it's not 3.5 billion years, it's not even 1 billion years. It's something on the order of hundreds of millions, which is way, way too short for having life. And but also it's just molecular stability. It's not just too short for life to have formed. It's just molecules don't stay around. Like I gave you this example. If you happen to have a sugar on which there is a base, and you happen to have 4 different bases on the different sugars, and they happen to have the right stereochemistry, all this is mountains of, that's hard to do in a modern laboratory. And then, if those somehow hooked together to form a code that could code for something, the building of an enzyme that could end up building some other structure. That RNA only lasts 4 hours or less, because it's probably longer. So it's not even now hundreds of millions of years. You only got 4 hours. And now it's got to find all the amino acids in that 4 hours. So it's like, there's only moments. There's only moments. And so if you could meet an organic chemist someday, meet them. There's none in this institution, apparently. But if you could meet one of them, you would say, well, what happens if you just don't work up your reactions? You just go home for the night and go to sleep and come back. They go, oh, no, I won't do that. I tried that once, and my reaction was just toast by the next day. These things don't last. They fall apart. And that's what nature is beset with. And they hydrolyze. And we have this atmosphere, this earth that's filled up with water. And water hydrolyzes a lot of these structures quite rapidly.
Hi, doctor. Thanks for your time. When I'm talking with atheists, usually the conversation they start with, like, what's your best evidence for the existence of God? And usually one of the places I start is life itself, consciousness, the fact that you wake up, there's trees and people, etc. And so therefore it begs the question, who created all of this? And so the conversation usually goes towards like, well, if there is a God, there is a creator who created that God. And you kind of get into this infinite regress problem. So I'm just curious if I'm sure you've addressed this before. I'm just kind of curious to hear what your response typically is.
Yeah, actually, I've never been asked that before. But I've heard people talk about this argument, but people don't normally ask me philosophical questions like that. So God is an uncreated being; He's always been, and that would be the typical answer, which is the biblical answer to this. And these are hard questions. There's something as fundamental as where did life come from? Just even life, let alone consciousness. Although there is an area now within biology that is talking about the conscious-like behavior of a cell, because it responds. You poke a cell and it learns don't go there, I get poked. You know, it learns how to deal with things, and bacteria are always changing based on what they're confronted with. And so it's almost as if they have some sort of cognition going on. It's different than the consciousness of a human being. But these are more than just simple little sensors that, oh, that is a molecule. There's something more sophisticated. So that interaction causes this huge cascade to occur within a cell. So a cell now develops so that an efflux pump to protect a bacterium so that it forces a drug back out. I mean, all these changes have now occurred based on an influence that came into it, which is approaching what consciousness does. We get confronted with something, and now we come with some response that we never would have come with had that influence not come upon us. So that we're seeing, even in the simplest of life forms, you see these sorts of things, and you go, wow, this thing is amazing. And how does all this come about? There is a reason why we build robots out of silicon and plastic and rubber and wires. Why don't we just build robots out of molecules? Like we're built. I mean, we have all these ubiquitous examples that we can do this. Why don't we just build out of molecules? It apparently works. Because we have no clue how to take molecules from a flask and build one of us. No clue. So we rather build it out of silicon and all these other materials and just kind of make it look like one of us. There's a reason for this. Molecules are like the hardest thing that you could think of to build sophisticated structure out of. It's so hard to do this with molecules. I'm not sure I answered your question, but okay. We got some other guys here too.
Hi, Dr. Tor. Thank you for your time. I think I consider myself a Christian, but one of the issues I find is like when I read the Bible, I want it to be very consistent with what we see in the world, like based on science. For me, like for example, when I hear in the Bible like the Earth is 6,000 years old, or like God literally took Adam's flesh and took it away to create Eve, I find it like hard to believe. Either it's like we have to believe some sort of metaphorical meaning of the Bible, or are we defending like the actual words on the Bible that says he did that? So what's your sort of response for like believing in the Bible and in the science?
Well, I never read in the Bible that the earth was 6,000 years old. So that's an extrapolation that you got from people counting lifetimes back, of which we know that there are certain gaps there. But even if they weren't, let's just say you counted back. The Bible, to me, seems pretty clear somewhere between Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1, and Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, something happened. And there was a void time. And with that void time, we have no idea what the age of the earth is. All right, so we have no idea anymore. We have no idea from that. But what we do know is throughout the 1950s, so this is in my lifetime now, throughout the 1950s, most scientists believed that the universe had no beginning. It always was, the steady state approximation. And then now these proposals that it had a beginning came much earlier in the 1920s, but it wasn't until 1964 with the discovery of background microwave radiation that we realized that the universe had a beginning. It had a beginning point, and we were in an expanding universe, and it was confirmed in 1964. And so the whole mindset shifted. So science changes dramatically over periods of decades. It changes. What killed off the dinosaurs? It was believed that climate change. Well, no, the Alvarez hypothesis, 1980, says that an asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, iridium-rich, filled the earth, filled the atmosphere with dirt and soot, and that killed off then the plants, killed off the herbivores, which killed off the carnivores, and that was the end of them. So science is constantly changing in its views. I mean, even more recently, what was formerly junk DNA when I started my career is now intergenic DNA and turns out to be super important for all regulation. And so now we're nowhere close to being similar to a chimpanzee. We were told we were 98% the same as a chimpanzee. Well, that's only for the protein coding part. When you look at the regulatory part, we're very different. So science is always changing. And our interpretations of the Bible change. And so how do we interpret these things? My interpretation of the Bible is constantly changing throughout my lifetime. I get different interpretations. So I've never seen a controversy between a fact of science and something that is clearly stated in the Bible. I've never seen it. If you've seen it, share it with me. I've never seen it. There are scientific theories, but theories are changing all the time. There are interpretations which you can have on a Bible portion, but another person can have another interpretation. There are other portions of the Bible that are not nearly as subject to interpretation because they're said multiple times over and over again. Touch me and see, I have flesh and bones as you see I have. And he just walks us through it, puts his hands on our cheeks and says, you hear me? Those things are very clear. And so you have both aspects of those changing. But, there's some things in science that will never change. Water is H2O, 2 hydrogens and oxygen. You can have different isotopes. Anywhere you go in the universe, that's going to be the same. But there are other things that are sometimes taught as facts that are just theories. So I haven't seen the controversies, personally.
Hi, thanks for coming. In the portion where we were discussing, science and abiogenesis, felt like we were kind of talking about knowing things in the standards of science, right? Empiricism and falsification. Whereas when we were talking, when you were talking about Jesus, we were kind of reasoning from principles about here's how humans operate, here's how they would do things. And I'd be curious just your thoughts generally on like reasoning under uncertainty, how those things are different, and how you just confront knowing things in the world.
No, that's fair. There's some things we can put under a microscope and we can look at. Historically, we don't do that much with things from that are 1,000 years old. We look at historical documents and we look at the testimony. We look at the human testimony at those times. Were those credible sources? And how much of them do we have? And that's what we do all the time. And then we go based on that. And what I gave you for Jesus and his resurrection was an historical proof, not a scientific proof. And historical proofs, we put people to death based on historical proofs. You find people guilty of things and you put them based on human testimony and historical proof. And that's what I used.
Again, thank you, Doctor, for coming. So I wanted to revisit my question in a slightly more refined way. So earlier I maybe did a little bit of a bait and switch by mentioning hydrothermal vents. I'd also mentioned deep sea pools, which is in reference specifically to brine pools, which are high pressure and low temperature environments on the bottom of ocean floors and so on, where, again, in the water column, very high salt environments form against subsidiary deposits or lower deposits. Mm-hmm. And my understanding of biochemical systems is that the simplest possible subset, without getting to a cell. I appreciate there's the greater mountain of reaching a cell, but the lesser hill before that is reaching RNA and protein simply reproducing each other. And I appreciate the protein folding space is massive, but within that there may be selection because there's an energetic gradient to choose the most efficient pathway at which a protein will interact with an RNA. So that seems to define a tremendously smaller subset in an organic molecule-rich brine pool. That seems to be a far, far, far smaller interactome than the 10 to the 90 or 10 to the 90 million or 90 billion, however many zeros we care to add on to the end. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that I would have to grant you so much to be able to even get there. You give me an RNA at the bottom of the ocean, in a pool that's very cold. It's at 2 degrees in some brine pool, or even at -5 degrees centigrade in some brine pool. There's so many steps that you have to go from small molecule to a fructose, to a sugar that now has a base on it and has 4 different bases, and how you put that pyrimidine, for example, on a fructose to get you the nucleotide to begin with. Now you got to get those nucleotides hooked together through the 3' 5' linkage without the 2' 5' linkage. And now you want to also be able to do the polymerization to get those, also having all these amino acids available to you, say 20 amino acids. How do you get RNA to form in a condensation polymer in the presence of amino acids? Because those also participate in condensation polymerizations. So condensation polymerizations have to have 99.99% purity in order to get a good condensation polymer. So to even get to near where you're talking about, you have to be granted so much that I would say, I would give you $10 million, $10 million, if you could go in a laboratory today with all your modern tools and deal with the small molecules that would be available on Earth and make even a nucleotide, let alone 4 different nucleotides and polymerize them. There's nowhere close to where you're going. So now you have set up a system for your own example. You've set up a system that has taken full advantage of biology, where you've said, I need to get really pure RNA, and that needs to be set up in line. And that RNA can now react with amino acids. But RNA and amino acids doesn't do anything. Even if you now had the RNA polymer and you had free amino acids and now you want to polymerize these on the RNA as a template, you need lots of support enzymes to bring in those amino acids to do this. The whole reading of the sequence, it's all a support system. And remember, that RNA is going to hydrolyze within hours. So all of that has to happen. So I just don't get it. Maybe I know too much. And that's often the problem when I'm speaking with biologists. I know the chemistry. Biologists don't do the chemistry. They buy kits. They really do. They buy kits that are made by chemists. Mix this, and everything is predetermined there with all these human linking groups. They have no idea of the complexity of the chemistry. But the people that argue with me the least are organic chemists, because they see exactly what I see. And even the guys that I challenge, that I call out their names on the internet, they run from me. They will not deal with it. A year ago, November, I had a conversation here with Lee Cronin, and I put up a bunch of problems with origin. He wouldn't touch any of them. He just talked about his assembly theory, which is a causal history. He wouldn't touch any of them. He was right in front of me. And it was to the faculty in the faculty lounge area, and it was with the faculty from Harvard and MIT were there. He wouldn't touch it, and he's not an organic chemist, and that's the mistake that he made coming into a room with me. No organic chemist will get near me, and it's not because I'm such a big awesome guy. No, that's not what it is. It's because they know exactly what I know, and they know I have the upper hand so much over them that they get creamed on this, so they don't get near it. Some people have called it a scam. A scam. The origin of life research is a scam. That's how far it is. And I would suggest that too. I would say it's a scam. It's just that I've offended so many people by coming. The title of my talk used to be, Origin of Life Research is a Scam. That was the title of my talk. And I was quoting one other famous guy who said, please don't quote me on that anymore. So I stopped putting it up, but I could just as well have said that.
All right. I'm going to say that's all the time we have now for the large group questions. I think if you're interested
I'll be here if
coming
you
to
want
talk to
come up and ask me
Professor
something.
Tor for a couple more minutes.
Yeah,
A
I'll be
while
here.
after this talk, you can come down to the front and chat with him. Thank you all so much for coming. If we could all join in a round of applause.
Thank you.
Professor Tor raised a lot of really interesting points about both science and God and Jesus. If anyone's interested in engaging more on those questions, we do have Professor Tor's contact information's up here with his generous offer to stay in touch with anyone. But as well, we also have QR codes on the doors as you're leaving. If you're interested in scanning that, we can also get you plugged in, grab meals, and send you info about our other events. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
I have two quick questions.
Yes.
One, just clarification. So